Despite being the last camp complex of its kind to be built by the Nazis, Auschwitz was the biggest and most destructive, the site of the mass murder of at least 1.1 million people, 90% of whom were Jews from almost every country in Europe. While victims died from beatings, starvation, disease, exhaustion, medical experimentation, or individual execution, most were killed with poison gas in specially constructed gas chambers. In this video, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at how those gas chambers actually worked. There won't be any weird animations or vague info that doesn't strictly apply to any particular gas chamber. We're going to go through every single one and look at how it operated based on the exact features and layout of the building. So let's take a look. So the very first thing to remember is that Auschwitz wasn't simply just one place. It was an enormous complex that consisted of a zone of interest of around 40 square kilometres, or just under 15.5 square miles, with 3 primary camps and approximately 40 sub-camps. Auschwitz I, also known as the main camp, or Stammlager in German, was the administrative centre of the whole complex and housed mainly political prisoners and Soviet prisoners of war. Auschwitz II, or Birkenau, was the death camp, where the majority of the crematoria and gas chamber buildings were located, and Auschwitz III, or Monowitz, was a concentration and labour camp, intended mainly for providing slave labour to nearby manufacturing facilities, the largest of which was the German chemical and pharmaceutical conglomerate IG Farben. In his autobiography, the camp commandant, SS Obersturmbannführer, or Lieutenant Colonel Rudolf Höss, said he was summoned to Heinrich Himmler's office in the summer of 1941, where he was informed by Himmler that Hitler had ordered the extermination of the Jewish people and that Auschwitz would serve a key role in this operation due to its location. Höss said that he was aware that gas vans had been used at other camps to kill people, where victims would be loaded into a special van and suffocated with its exhaust fumes. However, this method would be completely out of the question for Auschwitz, given the volume of people that would be arriving, and as a result, it was necessary to find an alternative killing process with a different gas. The solution the Nazis at Auschwitz came up with was Cyclone B, which was the trademark name for a commercial pesticide with cyanide as its active ingredient. Cyclone B consisted of silica pellets, or pellets of diatomaceous earth soaked in liquid cyanide. When the pellets were exposed to the air, the cyanide evaporated to produce deadly hydrogen cyanide gas. It was the deputy camp commandant, SS Hauptsturmführer, or Captain Karl Fritsch, who came up with the idea to use Cyclone B as the agent of the Holocaust at Auschwitz. Fritsch capitalised on the fact that several of his men had been transferred to Germany to learn how to use Cyclone B, and the fact that it was cheap and easy to obtain, and while Höss was away one day in September 1941, he experimented with it on Soviet prisoners of war in the basement of Block 11, which was effectively the camp penal block, a prison within the prison. The tests proved that Cyclone B was lethal against human beings, but it quickly became apparent that Block 11 wasn't the ideal location for such operations to continue. With no mechanical ventilation, the underground rooms were difficult to make gas tight and then air out. There was also the obvious difficulty of physically transferring the corpses to the crematorium, whose location on the opposite side of the camp did nothing to help keep these operations discreet. Fritsch solved these problems by moving the gassing to the crematorium itself and converting the morgue into a gas chamber capable of holding 700 to 800 people. Holes were cut into the roof to allow the Cyclone B pellets to be dropped in from above, and the ventilation system designed to cope with the foul air of decomposing corpses was more than capable of expelling poisonous gas. SS Untersturmführer, or Second Lieutenant Hans Stark, who was one of several SS officers who participated in the gassing of prisoners in Crematorium I. In fact, in his trial in Frankfurt, he openly admitted to inserting the gas on one occasion, and told the court, "At another later gassing, also in autumn 1941, Grabner ordered me to pour Cyclone B into the opening because only one medical orderly had shown up." During a gassing, Cyclone B had to be poured through both openings of the gas chamber room at the same time. This gassing was also a transport of 200 to 250 Jews, once again men, women and children. As the Cyclone B, as already mentioned, was in granular form, it trickled down over the people as it was being poured in. They then started to cry out terribly, for they now knew what was happening to them. This statement is significant in terms of the operation of this gas chamber because it strongly suggests that, unlike some of the other gas chambers, as will become apparent in the rest of this video, there was no mechanism or device for inserting and removing the Cyclone B pellets from Crematorium I's gas chamber. It was simply freely poured into the room and came into direct physical contact with the victims. Cyanide is not an easy death, and it's so deadly to human beings because it blocks our cells from being able to use oxygen. A concentration of just 0.03% of a single percent is fatal fatal to human beings in minutes. Death could take up to half an hour depending on the amount of gas used, how close the victims were to the point of gas insertion, and the ambient temperature, which affected how quickly the Cyclone B pellets gave off their deadly fumes. Cyanide is also an irritant, aggravating mucous membranes in a similar way to tear gas. The initial symptoms would have been a terrible burning sensation and a desperation for breathable air, followed by seizures, hypertension, coma, and respiratory and cardiac arrest. According to the SS doctor Johann Kremer, who was stationed at Auschwitz and documented multiple gassings in his diary at different locations, shouting and screaming of the victims could be heard through the opening, and it was clear that they fought for their lives. Once an SS doctor had determined that everyone was dead, the ventilation system was activated, and a group of prisoners euphemistically known as the Sonderkommando, or Special Squad, was faced with the task of cleaning out the gas chamber and cremating the bodies in the nearby ovens. Despite both the gassing and cremation being contained within Crematorium 1, it was still difficult to keep these operations discreet. Trucks and motorcycles would be parked near the crematorium and would rev their engines as loudly as possible in an attempt to cover up the screams of the dying, and anybody on the northeast side of the adjacent hospital block would have been able to observe the entire operation from the window. However, as the Reich Main Security Office transports of Jews kept coming, gassing started to take place in daylight, and the Sonderkommando would enter the gas chamber with gas masks to begin their work as soon as everyone was dead. With this in mind, and the fact that by early 1942 it was clear that Crematorium 1 was never going to be able to keep up with the number of Jews being sent to Auschwitz, the SS looked for an alternative. The solution they came up with was Bunker 1 in March 1942, an old farmhouse in a wooded area north of the nearby Birkenau subcamp, which became known as the Little Red House due to its brick construction. The SS bricked up the windows and converted its 4 rooms into 2 gas chambers. Absolutely nothing of Bunker 1 survived the war, not even the foundation, but here's a sketch of its layout based on eyewitness drawings by a Sonderkommando prisoner who worked there, Shlomo Dragon. Hatches were installed in the exterior walls to allow for the insertion of the gas, and on each gas chamber door was a sign, Zur Desinfektion, to disinfection. Victims were led into the gas chamber under the impression that they would be showered and disinfected before being assigned work duties and being reunited with any family members they'd been separated from. 2 wooden barracks were built nearby to allow victims to undress, and approximately 800 people could be gassed at a time in the building. In July or late June 1942, another farmhouse whose Polish occupants had been driven out by the SS was converted into gas chambers. Bunker 2 became known as the Little White House due to its white external plastering, and it was converted in much the same way as Bunker 1, although this time with 4 individual gas chambers. Here's a diagram of its layout and operation based on another Shlomo Dragon sketch. Victims entered the gas chambers via these doors, and the Cyclone B was inserted via hatches in the walls located here. Once all the victims were dead, their corpses were removed via these doors and loaded onto a cart that ran on a small gauge rail track. This cart was then pushed to the pits for burial, or in 1944 for open air burning. Bunker 2 was slightly bigger than Bunker 1 and had a maximum capacity of 1,200 victims. Nothing is left of Bunker 2 other than its foundations. Unlike Crematorium 1, these buildings had no mechanical ventilation. Gassing operations took place under the cover of darkness, and once all victims were dead, the building was aired out overnight so that the disposal of the bodies could begin in daylight. The most time-consuming element of these operations was never the actual act of murder, but the disposal of the bodies. At Bunker 1 and 2, this was mitigated by simply burying the corpses, but this wasn't a long-term solution for the SS, as it didn't do enough to hide the evidence of genocide, and the decomposing victims started to pollute the water table. Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, ordered the exhumation and burning of all the corpses, and the camp authorities looked for a more permanent alternative. The solution they decided upon consisted of 4 large crematoria and gas chamber buildings, the construction of which began at Birkenau in mid-1942. Crematorium 4 was the first to be completed and was handed over to the SS on the 22nd of March 1943. 9 days later, on the 31st, Crematorium 2 was handed over. Crematorium 5 was handed over on the 4th of April, and finally on the 25th of June, Crematorium 3. Once all the Birkenau crematoria were operational, Crematorium 1 was decommissioned as a gas chamber and crematorium and was never used for these purposes again. Bunkers 1 and 2 also stopped being used, although Bunker 2 was reopened in 1944 when the deportations to Auschwitz reached their highest levels and the crematoria couldn't keep up. The 4 new crematoria buildings at Birkenau had 2 different designs. Crematorium 2 had a furnace room on the ground floor and 2 large underground cellars, one of which was an undressing room, and the other slightly smaller cellar perpendicular to the main crematorium building was the gas chamber. This gas chamber was mechanically ventilated. Fresh air entered via this channel built into the top of the wall and the ceiling, and the dirty air was sucked out via this channel at the bottom. This gave the room a slightly vaulted appearance. Fresh air entered the room from the fresh air channel via perforated metal plates, and the ports for the air extraction channel were guarded with a crude muzzle made from a couple of metal rods folded over each other. These stuck out slightly into the chamber to prevent the ports from being blocked by corpses. The ventilation system was powered by electric motors in the roof space of the crematorium. Fresh air entered the gas chamber via this little chimney, and the dirty air was vented outside via a channel within this one. Offset from the central concrete support pillars that ran the length of the gas chamber were 4 wire mesh columns for inserting and removing the gas. These were designed so that the gas could be inserted without the victims interfering with it, and so that it could be removed as quickly as possible once everyone was dead, so that the Sonderkommando could begin their work. These columns terminated outside at ground level in the crematorium courtyard in small chimney-like structures sealed with either wooden or concrete covers. 3 of these chimneys are clearly visible in this ground-level photograph of Crematorium 2 taken in early 1943. Inside the gas chamber, the gas insertion columns had a footprint of 70 by 70 centimetres and were plated with a very thick wire mesh. Within this column was another column of a slightly finer wire mesh, and inside this second internal column was a shaft of empty space. Inside this space was a movable prism-like canister with a wire attached at the top, surrounded by an even finer wire mesh. The Cyclone B crystals were poured into this canister, and it was lowered into the column to give off its deadly fumes. Once the gassing was complete, the column lid would be removed, the canister pulled out, and the Cyclone B pellets removed. In autumn 1943, according to the Sonderkommando member Henrik Tauber, who was stationed in Crematorium 2, shower heads were installed in the gas chamber, and benches and clothes hooks were installed in the undressing room to reinforce the illusion that this was a harmless bathing and disinfestation facility. Some of these benches were found by the Russians in the camp construction yard when they liberated the camp. Here you can see a long bench and some smaller square benches which were installed around the concrete support pillars in the undressing room. At the back on the left is a stack of clothes hooks, on the right an enormous stack of the long benches that ran along the walls. Victims entered the undressing room via this staircase and were told to remember the number of the hook on which they'd hung their clothes and to tie their shoes together so they wouldn't lose them. Those who were incapable of walking to the crematorium were brought there by truck. The end of the undressing room narrowed to form a corridor that led to the gas chamber. Women and children entered first, followed by the men, all of whom were prevented from leaving by a row of SS men who gradually moved towards the door as the chamber filled. The unwilling were pushed and beaten and threatened with dogs. Those whose disruption the SS felt was a risk to the operation were brought up from the basement and shot in the furnace room or a small room next to it. Once everyone was inside, a maximum of approximately 2,000 people, the enormous gas-tight door was bolted shut, the lights were turned off, and the signal was given to insert the gas. According to Henrik Tauber, once everyone was locked in the gas chamber, but just before the Cyclone B was inserted, the air was pumped out via the air extraction system in order to accelerate the process and make the gas chamber as suffocating and as inhospitable as possible. A truck, painted to look as if it belonged to the Red Cross, followed every transport to the crematorium. The artist and former Sonderkommando member David Euler depicted this truck in one of his drawings. It was typically parked in the courtyard to serve as a reassuring presence, but it wasn't anything of the sort. It was this truck that brought the tins of Cyclone B to the gas chamber and the SS staff who would insert it. A tin of Cyclone B was positioned by each chimney, and upon the instruction of the supervising doctor, a medical orderly would walk between each chimney, open each tin, and insert its contents into the gas chamber. Allied aircraft inadvertently photographed Auschwitz in 1944, and in this photograph of Birkenau dated 25th of August, you can clearly see the path taken by those who stepped onto the roof of Crematorium 2's gas chamber and walked between and worked around the 4 gas insertion ports. According to the camp commandant Rudolf Höss, it could be observed through the peephole in the door that those who were standing nearest to the induction vents were killed at once. It can be said that about 1/3 died straight away. The remainder staggered about and began to scream and struggle for air. The screaming, however, soon changed to the death rattle, and in a few minutes all lay still. After 20 minutes at the latest, no movement could be discerned. The time required for the gas to take effect varied according to the weather and depended on whether it was damp or dry, cold or warm. To accelerate the evaporation of the gas, portable iron baskets filled with hot coals were used to preheat the gas chamber in the colder months. The SS also experimented with preheating the gas chamber using hot air from the rooms which housed the ventilation motors that powered the airflow through the ovens and up through the chimney. However, this project wasn't successful and had to be abandoned. Once everyone was dead, the ventilation system was activated and members of the Sonderkommando entered the gas chamber and began the nightmarish work of removing victims' gold teeth and hidden valuables and cutting off the women's hair. They entered the gas chamber immediately with gas masks without waiting for the ventilation system to make the room safe. Corpses were dragged from the gas chamber onto an electric goods lift, which brought them up to the furnace room, where they were then loaded into the ovens. The Cyclone B carriers were lifted out from their wire mesh columns and the pellets were removed. The gas chamber was washed out with a hose connected to a water outlet in the corridor between the gas chamber and the undressing room. Damage to any internal fittings, such as the lights or ventilation ports, was repaired, and if necessary, the gas chamber was painted with a fresh coat of whitewash. The trap was set again for the next transport. Crematorium 3 was a mirror image of Crematorium 2 and functioned in the same way. At the end of 1943, the gas chambers of Crematoria 2 and 3 were divided in half with a brick wall that had a gas-tight door identical to the main gas chamber door. The goal of this was to make it easier to gas smaller groups of prisoners. This was done in the chamber furthest from the main door. Crematoria 4 and 5 were of a much simpler construction, with the gas chambers, furnace room and undressing room all at ground level. At the far east of each building, below the two chimneys, was the furnace room. Next to this was the undressing room, and in this lower roof section at the far west of the building were 3 gas chambers. The gas was inserted into the gas chamber through several gas-tight shutters measuring 30 by 40 centimetres built into the external walls. The process was the same, except that the SS medic responsible for inserting the gas would have to climb up a little step ladder or stand on a chair to open the hatch and insert it. Like Crematoria 2 and 3, Crematoria 4 and 5 were also mirror images of each other, and there's an extremely small piece of anecdotal evidence suggesting that the gas chambers in these buildings also used some kind of wire mesh device to aid the insertion and the removal of the gas. However, there's no information available explaining how these devices worked in Crematoria 4 and 5 and what they looked like. The gas chambers of Crematoria 4 and 5 were also aired out naturally by just opening the doors in much the same way as Bunker 1 and 2. There's reason to believe that ventilation systems were planned, but I'm not aware of any evidence that they were actually installed, and virtually all witness testimony on the subject states that the gas chambers of Crematoria 4 and 5 didn't have any kind of mechanical ventilation system. However, solid fuel stoves were installed in each gas chamber to preheat them and aid the evaporation of the gas. These are marked on the blueprints, and their little chimneys are clearly visible from outside. The extermination process at Crematoria 4 and 5 was broadly the same as that in Crematoria 2 and 3. Victims walked to the building or were brought there by truck and were told that they would be showered and disinfected. After undressing in the central undressing room, they were ordered into the gas chambers and SS medics would insert the Cyclone B. There were lights in the gas chambers, but unlike Crematoria 2 and 3, no dummy shower heads. Once the gassing was completed, the corpses were dragged back into the undressing room in preparation for the ovens. With the deportation of 437,000 Jews from Hungary during the late spring and early summer of 1944, Auschwitz entered its most destructive period, and the crematoria simply couldn't keep up. As a result, bodies were burned in open-air pits behind Crematorium 5, and Bunker 2, or the Little White House, was reopened. The summer weather meant that victims were forced to undress outside when there simply hadn't been enough time to clear the undressing room from the previous transport. The operation of the Birkenau crematoria and gas chambers started to come to an end in the autumn of 1944, when Crematorium 4 was damaged beyond repair in a Sonderkommando uprising in October. In early November, Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, ordered the gassings at Auschwitz to stop. Later that month, and in order to avoid a repeat of the liberation of the Majdanek extermination camp in which the Red Army captured the camp and its gas chambers intact, Himmler ordered the destruction of the Auschwitz gas chambers and crematoria. Through December and January, Crematoria 2 and 3 were dismantled before finally being dynamited on January 20th, 1945. Crematorium 5 was kept running the entire time to dispose of those who continued to die from all other causes until it too was finally dynamited on January 26th, the day before Auschwitz was liberated.